Hi everyone, welcome to Griffith University Art Museum's series of public programs relating to the exhibition Jeff Gibson, Countertypes. I'm Angela Goddard and Director of the Art Museum here and co-curator of the exhibition with Dr. Wes Hill, who's also joining us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which I'm joining you from, which is the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and to acknowledge elders past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us here with this program. We have the great privilege of having Jeff Gibson, the artist whose work we're looking at within this exhibition, joining us today, as well as John Gillies, who studied with Jeff, and they also emerged through the art scene at a very similar time and collaborated on some projects together. So we're super interested in having a conversation about those early years for both of you, and to think about some of the pathways that have led to your practices in this current moment, which is deeply interesting. Thank you so much for joining us, John and Jeff. Great to have you. Where are you joining us from? It'd be interesting to hear. John?
Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York, home. This is my studio to the left.
I'm in my studio.
To the right.
Okay, I'm in my studio in Leichhardt in the inner west of Sydney.
Great, and Wes?
I'm in Lennox Head, sunny Lennox Head.
So I'm keen to firstly perhaps set the scene of your early years for both of you. Jeff, you were born in 1958, you graduated school in around 1975, and John is born in 1960, he graduates around 1977. You both grow up in different parts of Queensland, but then you end up together studying at the Darling Downs Institute of Advanced Education in around 77 to 1980. Perhaps, John, you could tell us how on earth did you end up studying here in Toowoomba at that time?
I think it was the closest option. I didn't want to go to Brisbane to go to art school. I wanted to go to art school. So it was either go to art school or join a band. And I'd been involved in the Darling Downs Youth Theatre, which was a kind of a proof of concept of youth theatre in Australia, which was actually really interesting. I was just talking about that yesterday, which was actually set up by people who'd been working with Jerzy Grotowski, the Polish avant-garde theatre director. So I was auditioned for that, and I was part of that company as a technician, but also a musician. So, and I've been playing in bands, and I've been painting for a long time. And anyway, so people knew of the youth theatre. That sort of led to threads in other parts of my work, even quite recently. That kind of strange connection that happened in the
Playing in punk bands, John?
No, I was doing everything. I was playing country and western. I was like the fill-in drummer. When they, like when a country band had their drummer had an car accident, they would ring me up and I'd go out and so, whatever. Jazz, whatever.
Great. So you grew up on a farm, John?
Yeah, but my father worked for the agriculture department, so he was did research as well. So so I'm interested in rural kind of things, and went to school in Warwick. But yeah, playing in bands was sort of a way out of that kind of thing, and touring all over northern New South Wales playing, and also the youth theatre was a really quite important thing. I was talking to Greg Howard yesterday, who we might talk about more, and he was saying in Queensland in the 70s, theatre was considered it was an edgy thing, a very edgy thing, and it was all over the world, and everyone was reading that book, Grotowski's Towards a Poor Theatre. think that's an incredibly influential book. So people knew about these things from the book, not necessarily from a lived experience. And I think that influenced performance art as whole, happenings and sort of experiencing something in the real, in the now, in the kind of not mediated in any way. This was an idea that was floating around really strongly. You know, the popularized version of that was a musical like Hair or something like that, really, which is directed by New York director Joseph Chaikin, who was rooted in that. And the reason why Toowoomba was interesting, in fact, was they'd appointed an American actor, theatre director and television director called Robert Gist, Gist. There's I just looked him up yesterday, big IMDb. He directed Star Trek and things like that. And he was really deeply rooted in the American experimental theatre that was happening then. And he basically employed anyone he thought was avant-garde. They were in this heavy duty kind of method acting stuff, which was getting a bit out of control. It became cult-like. So that's, according to Greg Howard, that's why in Brisbane, Toowoomba was an edgy place. You know, he was thinking that's an edgy institution. There's interesting things happening there. This Gist character, it's really, you know, Robert Gist is an interesting person who employed lots of other people. So it was it had a bit of a vibe about it, I guess. And maybe Jeff can talk about why he chose to go and study in Toowoomba.
Yeah, Jeff?
For very different reasons, John. I mean, my path to Toowoomba was quite different to yours. And, you know, you just answered a whole bunch of questions I had for you. The thing is, I became fairly quickly aware that you sort of arrived fully formed by comparison to a lot of the students. You know, you showed up knowing what avant-garde cinema was. You showed up knowing what performance was. You showed up knowing all sorts of stuff that I was just completely clueless about. In fact, I was completely clueless, period. You know, I arrived a very frustrated and lost adolescent, well, post-adolescent, I guess, you know, through high school. Wes and Angela, you've heard this story a bunch of times now, but people out there, maybe not. I went to Christian Brothers all-boys high school. Clearly, art was not part of the plan for the Catholic Army there. There was no creative activities whatsoever, no dance, no music, no art, no performance, no nothing. It was just did not exist. And it was pretty clear to me that that was, you know, that was what I wanted to do. That was what I was naturally inclined to do. I mean, as a kid, all I wanted to do was write and draw. So by the time I was finished at that high school, I was, you know, extremely kind of disenchanted. I couldn't find my path at all. I didn't know what to do. I acted out and, you know, basically kind of just refused to cooperate with society by the end of high school. And just, you know, I made it through high school, but then I just dropped out. And because, you know, basically I just felt like my path, I was denied access to my path. I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't feel that I was equipped to embark upon, you know, the journey that I so desperately wanted to embark upon. So, you know, I just became a lost soul for a year. And my lovely parents were obviously very concerned about this. I was floundering. And they, you know, really pressed me to like, you know, okay, you're not going to do all of the things that, you know, with all these various options that they put in front of me that were just anathema. And they said, you know, like, what is it that you could see yourself doing? And I, at that point, you know, I was deeply involved in kind of, you know, underground pop culture of any sort. I was a total music head. I spent every cent I could scratch together buying records. You know, I had a good friend who went to like, you know, Corinda High and knew the Saints. And so I was kind of like privy to, you know, you know, of course, at that point, anybody with their antennae up was aware of the Velvet Underground and what was going on in New York and so on. So I had this kind of knowledge of subculturalism. And that was really my only access to anything creative at all, you know. So anyway, I was a total addict to New Musical Express. I would write music criticism in my bedroom as a teenager, that kind of thing, fantasizing that maybe I could be part of this world on the other side of the world, So, I ultimately said to my parents, well, I could see myself being a critic, I could see myself being a writer or a journalist or something like that. And then, they rolled out, I think there was a journalism degree available at the University of Queensland. I was so fed up with Brisbane and, the police state and Joh Bjelke-Petersen, and at this stage there were, this was just prior to the ban on the street marches and all the rest of it. But, it was bubbling up. You felt it on the street. I was harassed by police all the time because I looked different, which I went out of my way to do, obviously. But so consequently, I didn't want to study in Brisbane. And they said, well, there's a journalism and media studies course in Toowoomba. And I just went, yeah, sure, that sounds good. And then I went off hitchhiking around Australia. And when I came back, they had enrolled me in Toowoomba. By then I'd done a lot of kind of, tedious things. I mean, I worked for the public service for a few months until I couldn't bear it anymore. I started a screen printing apprenticeship, which was very interesting, in terms of learning the medium and all the rest of it. But, this was printing, it was purely commercial work, extremely toxic, very, very unhealthy. And so it didn't last very long at that either, all of which added to my parents' concern, I'm sure. But anyway, by then I thought, what, college does sound like a good idea, and getting out of Brisbane sounds like a better idea. And journalism and media studies was the part that attracted me more than anything. Seems like at least a partial fit. So off I went. And then once I got there, I had a lot of attitude. This was 1976. I had not completely embraced the kind of punk ethos yet at that point, but I was totally infatuated with it. And so I had a lot of attitude is what I'm saying. And the journalism course was very kind of mainstream media. And I was not having it. And they eventually kind of took me aside and said, I'm not sure that this is the course for you. However, you should look into Marshall McLuhan. And I did, and my head exploded. And that was the beginning of everything for me. I felt like, yes, this is the beginning of my discourse, And so at that point, I really kind of hunkered down and started, getting into it and enjoying it and cutting my own path through the journalism and media studies course, which the lecturers, I have to say, they were totally cool about this. First of all, they turned me on to that. And second of all, they just said, go, so long as you're working, it's all good. Anyway, in the midst of all of that, in my first year of journalism and media studies, I also did a visual arts minor. And it quickly became apparent to me that most of the people doing visual arts had no more experience or no more knowledge than I did about, the world of visual art and whatever. And so I thought, what, I can do this. So I saw my year out at journalism and media studies, and then just jumped ship over to the visual arts department, switched. And so I would have started visual arts at the same time that you came in, John. And I never looked back. From that point on, it was just, it's been a wild ride, the entire time, 40 odd years or whatever it is. That was really the beginning of everything for me. I found myself in Toowoomba, and I'd been so, despairing and frustrated for so long that to finally find yourself in that way, I just completely threw myself into everything. It was a time of just intense experimentation. I did everything, everything I could possibly think of. And, which is a great thing to do at art school. And, I have to say it was loose, it was a great structure, and it was a kind of a Bauhaus model, we would do a bunch of things, and then you would narrow your sights. And then in third year, you would narrow it down to one thing or two if you wanted to, And it worked incredibly well for me, but it wasn't rigorous from an art historical point of view. It wasn't rigorous from a theoretic. It didn't exist. There was no art theory. So I kind of regard myself as an autodidact in that regard. And things didn't really take off for me in that regard, in that respect, until I got to Sydney. So my time in Toowoomba was really just focused on trying my hand at everything, you know, and developing skills and figuring out my aesthetic and, you know, just figuring out what worked for me and what didn't work for me. Whereas you, John, you arrived knowing a whole bunch of stuff, and
I'd actually been,
you were kind of fully formed by
not really
my standards.
I'd been painting from when I was 9, kind of seriously, and
Right.
some art teacher had picked up, that kid's really good at art, and my parents, thank God for them, they sent me to a couple of art classes to this guy.
Oh, that's fantastic.
German guy who was fantastic, taught me post-impression.
There was no such teacher for me, you know. I mean, I was just blubber, unformed mass. You know.
And John, maybe John, you could describe the teaching style and the facilities that were there in Toowoomba.
Well, I think Jeff said open, and that was really good. And it was interdisciplinary. It's creative arts. I don't know what it's like now. So I was doing visual arts major and then music minor, and I think Jeff was doing journalism major or minor. You might have swapped, and visual arts.
I did. I flipped. Yes. Modern European history. I did journalism and modern European history, both of which were extremely invaluable ultimately.
Yeah. Great. And people like Kev Carmody, who was there when we were there, he was doing history major and music minor. So it was, but in fact, I spent most of my time early on doing music for the theatre productions, some of which were really interesting. And I ended up majoring in sculpture, but I didn't make any sculptures, making performance and video work and etc. We'll probably get into that a bit more.
I seem to remember you exhibiting a crumpled up piece of paper as a
sculpture.
Oh
yeah, I was making crumpled up pieces of paper.
Yeah.
I think Marguerite
it was anti-sculpture. It was, you know.
Yeah.
Martin Creed stole your idea.
Yeah, it was like the early computers used to use massive amounts of paper, so there was all of and they used to have what is that? Carbon paper between it, so you got these great reams of this black paper. It was beautiful.
That's right, I remember this.
And I used to crumple it up and make forms out of it, and I think Marguerite had one, and sometimes using also audio tape or videotape, making forms out of that. So yes, I was making sculpture, I forgot.
And so John, yes, go on.
I think that physicality, having a sculpture training like that, and Paul Selwood was a sculpture teacher who was fantastic, who'd been he'd been working in London.
He was a sort of Anthony Caro.
Yeah, but King, he'd been working with King as a studio assistant.
That's right.
And he actually brought him out. So it was like assemblage, like putting stuff together and turning it around and putting it together, that sort of classic modernist way of approaching sculpture. And I think that's really useful. Actually, he was a really good teacher because it was a methodology of approaching any kind of material, really. It was a kind of collage aesthetic a bit. So putting it together another way, turning it around, having a look at them the other way. Usually the first way you put it together is not very interesting, and then the second and third way you put it together might be interesting. So I got a lot from that. He was a good teacher. And of course there was David Perry was he was teaching film and video, and I was the last student to do film and video at that institution. No one else wanted to do it. They wanted to make Japanese ceramics or something. So it's a kind of
gamelan.
Yeah, well, there was a gamelan too, actually, which was actually fantastic. So there was an amazing teacher from Indonesia, Wayan. What's his name? Everyone's called Wayan. Everyone's called Wayan in Bali. Wayan Gandra. And if you say Wayan Gandra's name in Bali, they go, "Ooh, Wayan Gandra! Like he's a big deal." He kind of semi-invented this new style of gamelan music. So he was teaching in Toowoomba occasionally, and actually. There was the ethnomusicology department, which I spent a bit of time in, which kind of was interesting later on for me.
Hey, John, are you studying these, other minors or other units? But in terms of your studio practice, I know from Jeff's story that he's primarily still producing abstract painting. What are you producing for your final work? Are you starting to get into performance?
Oh yeah, I'm presenting performances and videotapes, and also these. I forgot about crumpled up paper and stuff. Yeah. Just back to the ethnomusicology class. That's actually one of the recordings. Jolly Liawonga, who's a senior songman, a Yolngu songman. That was actually done by our teacher, Doug Myers, who just died recently. Actually, pretty interesting. We had to transcribe all of that. That was our exercise. To sit down because Doug was in the Northern Territory. Said, "Okay, transcribe that." So it's like in my head. It's interesting.
He was a super interesting guy, Doug Myers.
Yeah, he wasn't an he wasn't really an anthropologist. He was a muso, and he kind of got a lot of shit because of that. But he did some interesting work. I remember he brought a whole lot of people down from Yolngu country down to Toowoomba, and this young guy who was talking to brought his spears, and he thought he'd test them out in the park down there. So he just chucks his spear. Like it just went from one end of the park to the other. And I thought maybe that's not a good idea to do that here. Like it was really impressive. So he had all these amazing connections with these amazing people. And he wanted me to go to Papua New Guinea and record stuff with him, but I got sick. Unfortunately, it would have been amazing flying around in an Air Force plane recording amazing music. So anyway, there was all these kind of things that you could dip into if you wanted to, and learning the discipline of gamelan is a really great thing. Like Wayne Gandra would say, if you have to be bored to be good at this, you've got to be bored. You've got to know it so well. You've got to, and then you act like an insect. You're like a whole lot of crickets in a rice paddy. You have to. That's how we're together. We're a whole bunch of crickets in the rice paddy, which is a really great different approach. It's not all about you.
So the music scene in Toowoomba was, the live music scene. Were you getting involved in that at the time, John?
Not me, Jeff was. Just back to what he was saying about. I think I first heard the Saints on the ABC. So and in fact, I don't know whether their clip for Stranded was actually made by This Day Tonight, which is what the 7:30 report came in, but you would see things like that would suddenly appear on TV because Brisbane had its own television show. So yeah, it was like, wow. And again with NME, I used to save up to buy copies of NME, so I knew about some gig happening in London that there were 50 people at, which is totally bizarre, and what Fela Kuti is doing, what Kraftwerk are doing, or that.
It's amazing what you can receive, at the age of like 16 through 18. Yeah. I know this, from my daughter, and you would know it from your kids too, John. You just have this ability to pick up things. Well, later in life, you're just so bogged down by so much information.
Yeah, other people bring me stuff.
It's incredible what I tuned into at the age of 17 in Brisbane. I'm still blown out by it.
I used to lie in bed on the farm with a crystal radio in my ear, listening to Double J in Sydney because you can only get it at night time. And it was like, oh, the Stooges, oh, Kraftwerk, oh, Fela Kuti, like it was all this amazing music.
Yeah.
Like, whoa.
Yeah.
And John, you were saying that
they were siren songs, these things you said before, like, oh God, there's the Saints, it was always just this thing that kind of punctured the kind of, soul finality of existence with something really kind of exciting and transformative.
That guitar sounded like...
There were things like that happened in my, suburban upbringing that just ignited something in me that is still burning today.
Like the sound of that guitar.
On TV was mind-blowing, Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted there.
No,
but just hearing that guitar, how it just cut out of the TV speaker in your lounge room, it was just like, whoa, this sounds like a Victor Motomoa that's gone crazy. It's just like, it's just like...
It got your attention.
Yeah, all square wave kind of energy coming out. Yeah, so they were very media products, they were able to be... There was sympathetic people in the media that put this stuff out. This is kind of edgy youth culture that's going to, so Dave Perry also turned up in Toowoomba teaching for 2 years. I was the last film and video person.
He was only there for 2 years?
2 or 3. Yeah, he built the studio. He first of all built a studio at Griffith University where he made his work. And these were very important, these studios, because without these studios, there was that one in Griffith, there was one in Paddington in Sydney, there was one at Open Channel in Melbourne. There was no other independent video production in Australia. So these were like facilities that people built. Stephen Jones has done a lot of work on the importance of these centres, because video was a really expensive thing, you know, couldn't afford. So he went to Toowoomba and built a studio there, and that's how I really got involved in that studio, and I became a lifelong friend of Dave's. But Dave was a painter who worked for the ABC as a technician in the 60s and made some of the earliest experimental moving image in Australia, and some of the first video art in Australia, and then moved to the UK, taught there for a couple of years, and came back to Australia and spent these couple of years teaching in Toowoomba. So I probably wouldn't have been making video if it wasn't for him, because he was also technically very astute. He was one of the founders of Ubu Films, which are really the first sort of avant-garde film group in Australia. Very influential, and to the development of the kind of the new wave Australian cinema in the 70s, also, because he mentored people like Phil Noyce and etc. Yeah, so, and they were very much. They also set up the Filmmakers Co-op in Sydney, and that actually there's just a new documentary that John Hughes in Melbourne and Tom Zabriskie in Sydney have produced that was premiered at the Melbourne International Film Festival about the co-op, which is should be pretty interesting. It has interviews with Albie Toms, who was Dave's co-collaborator. So that's the connection there with Dave Perry, and I've got one of his works here that was actually shot in the Griffith University studio and using the bush outside leaking in, and it's been shown at the Tate Modern and all kinds of places. It's a beautiful work, sort of formalist video work about space and live mixing and.
Yeah, and that's a really important originary work for our video art collection, which is incredibly unusual in terms that my predecessors were collecting these works and looking after them and within an institutional context before most other institutions were looking at this work as something that should be collected. Yeah,
nobody was collecting video art or moving image in Australia. There was a collection of some experimental film by the National Film and Sound, the Screen Studies collection was collecting stuff, but not video work so much. Oh, they actually had a really good collection of American video art, like Conchi and all these people, but it's all rotted away in there. But that was Griffith was the only place collecting. That was very much Marguerite, I think, pushing that. And there was only one gallery in Australia which showed video work, which was Roslyn Oxley in Sydney, who I showed with in the 80s. And there was one gallery in Japan, Video Gallery Scan, and they picked up my work in 1982 or 3. So I was showing in Japan with Bill Viola and all these people that were there. So that at that time, and I was actually showing student work that I made in Toowoomba at Scan. So that was actually the first. There was a touring show. There was a show in Tokyo of Australian work in '83 called Continuum, which is the first exhibition of contemporary Australian art in Japan, which was quite influential. I was just looking up Japanese Wikipedia about it yesterday, and was saying it was packed. Because I remember when I first went there, when I had shows later on in Spiral Hall, they all knew who I was, which was bizarre, from showing a video that I made in Toowoomba.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So
experimental film. Yeah, I should just mention the name. Fujiko Nakaya is the person who is behind that whole thing, who's a very senior Japanese artist who you might know from the fog sculpture in the National Gallery. She was very much behind Video Gallery Scan and the connection with Australia.
Amazing work. So experimental film is crossing over into your practices, performance work, and of course music. So are you both playing in bands at this time in Toowoomba as well?
If we were, I think we were playing in very different kinds of bands. I mean, John, you said that you know, for you in high school or whatever, it was either go to art school or form a band. I went to art school to form a band. You know? I mean, as soon as, you know, again, as soon as I found my path, as soon as I came to believe that I could do what I wanted to do, and, you know, be who I wanted to be, and you know, what completed that process was finally jumping ship, as I say, and signing on with the visual arts. And then as soon as you know, this was my second year in Toowoomba, once I was, you know, majoring in visual arts and minoring in journalism and modern European history. You know, it was just natural osmosis. I mean, just a bunch of us found each other. In fact, we were all living together in the same farmhouse out, you know, Cambodia, if that means anything to anybody. And, you know, it was the time, of course, when, you know, if anybody was plugged into the Sex Pistols and the Damned and, you know, the Buzzcocks and, you know, on the American side, blah, 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 you know, this, you know, this story now, it's like a string of cliches. But if you are plugged into all of that at the time, then the logical thing to do is to start a band, you know, if for no other reason than just have a ton of fun, you know. So there wasn't a lot
of other stuff happening. Yeah, it was boring. Life was boring.
Yeah, no, it was boring. You had to make your own fun, you know, but this was really exemplary fun. And there was one guy there who I became very close to very quickly, Stephen Butler, who was actually a natural musician, you know. He had, you know, again, he showed up fully formed in a different way to you, John. He showed up with like 20 or 30 original songs under his belt, you know, and he was doing all the kind of folk nights and all around town. But, you know, he was, he and I just were a kind of a natural partnership, I suppose. And then, you know, James Rogers, who was in the sculpture department, played drums. Kieran, who I think was doing a humanities subject, I can't remember. You know, he ended up playing the bass or whatever. I mean, it was just a very organic thing. It's just like a, you know, bunch of kids in a play group who suddenly all of a sudden discover that, you know, this is something that they think they can do. So, you know, we were off to the races very quickly. And, you know, it was just a wonderful moment when ugliness and ineptitude were incredibly kind of sexy and desirable. And, you know, so we just kind of set sail. It didn't last long, but it was great while it did. And that was pretty much, you know, my Toowoomba days. There was like a block of time there where that kind of cultural moment burned very brightly. And it happened to coincide with my time at Toowoomba, you know. So that was my experience. But I mean, you know, I was an absolute rank amateur. I mean, I could barely play, barely keep time. But it didn't matter, you know. We had one competent guy who could sing and keep time, and the drummer, you know, James, similar position. He learned to play drums, I think, you know, on the spot, as I learned to play guitar on the spot. And in no time at all, you know, we were making a kind of, you know, cacophonous, a beautiful cacophonous noise that that held together somehow, you know, by virtue of the people who could play. Whereas you, John, you know, I always knew that you were actually an accomplished musician, you know, I couldn't have played in any other band except a punk band. I just did not have the chops to do that, you know. And then later, once I moved to Sydney and, you know, all of that had kind of subsided, and it became apparent that, you know, to take this to the next phase, you actually needed to be able to play your instrument. Well, that was the point at which I kind of signed off, you know. I mean, I either had to dedicate myself to that or dedicate myself to visual arts and writing. And I felt that I was, you know, I had a natural aptitude with visual arts and writing, whereas I didn't really feel I had a natural aptitude with music. So I just kind of bailed. So, you know, my involvement in music and bands grew from my fascination with subculturalism and underground culture in general, you know, a desire to create another world, any other world than the Joe Bjelke-Peterson ruled world, which was, you know, absolutely kind of repellent and abhorrent to me. You know, once that moment passed, you know, I just let it go and went back to being a music fan, you know, and I've been a music fanatic since as long as I can remember, you know. I love music. but I'm not a natural musician, whereas John, you obviously have chops.
Yeah, so not a lot at that stage, and I guess when I was at college or uni, I wasn't doing that kind of music. I was doing kind of more experimental things, and I was doing, sort of process-based music, probably under the influence of Greg Howard, also again, quite important. Process, because he'd studied with Alvin Lucier in the States, and he'd been going to the Kitchen a lot in New York, the Kitchen Center for Music and Dance, I think it was called then, and which is still going, which is a really seminal kind of space for the development of all kinds of people's work, including Laurie Anderson and Phil Glass and all these people. So very much associated with minimalism and the New York thing. So there was that connection there through Greg, which was pretty amazing to have, and very strong influence. Amazing. Again, reading about things that were happening in New York, and then so I was doing all those pieces, and then later on, when I finished art school in Sydney, then I started playing in bands seriously, including a post-punk jazz band called Great White Noise, which had a bit of success, underground kind of success.
Which I remember very fondly. You were amazing. That was incredible.
Yeah, so we played lots of art gigs, Art Unit, and those people all went on. Sandy Evans, who's an amazing sax player, and so it's a lot of students from the con. So it had the energy of punk and kind of the rhythm section of punk, but post-punk really, but combined with jazz and sort of avant-garde forms of jazz. That was the idea. So it's kind of
a little bit of Hendrix thrown in too, I remember.
Yeah, Michael Sheridan, who also worked with me on lots of my own performances, like at IMA and things like that. So I started bringing that kind of music into it. So I guess that there was a shift that happened with me, and probably lots of us, from the kind of 70s conceptualism, which is really important as a basis. I see myself like as a post-conceptual artist. So they're rooted in those kind of strongly conceptual ideas, and then being influenced more by, I think actually the American writer Douglas Davis was really important to me. It's kind of shifting focus towards popular forms and forms that you could insert kind of more challenging ideas into popular culture or alternative culture. I think there was like a definite change from formal to informal around 1981 or 82.
And so, John, you mentioned that they're light-on theory in Toowoomba, but are you getting conceptual art history? Are you developing, or both of you? Are you seeking this stuff out on your own terms, or?
Trying to, reading magazines basically, but I think conceptually, like for me, Greg Howard was really important because he had that background in this music tradition and minimalism, which actually was not just about music, but was about all the arts, and that was something that was happening in the United States in the 70s. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in multidisciplinarity, all these. And I guess then I felt very connected to what was happening in New York in the late 70s, early 80s with the no wave movement, which was really music, bands, but also film, and then and collaborative art making, and worked on all these different levels. So when I first went to New York, there was kind of the tail end of that. The collab movement had happened in those artists that came out of collab, and met some of those people and met some of those bands from them. But that was a really interesting thing because it was much more art-based, but it had this music element to it as well. But theory-wise, it was very patchy for me, probably Jeff more methodical. But then there was the coming to Sydney. That was where really connected, the Sydney Uni and UTS, and I taught at UTS and met a lot of, people that were writing philosophy or theory and things like that. So Sydney was where it was happening.
Before you both went to Sydney, you asked Jeff to be in a performance of yours, didn't you, at Griffith?
We used to organise things together. I think we did a workshop with the guy from the IMA on performance, and it was kind of this whole idea of like moving to performance rather than happenings in the visual arts, so much more structured kind of ideas. So we organised lots of events, which were great, and then we did. Greg Howard actually, through Marguerite, was doing an experimental music workshop at Griffith University, and I think, did you do that workshop?
No, but I remember an evening of performances at Griffith, and I think I wrote on your coattails here. I mean, I think you invited me to do this. James Rogers came along, and there was a program of like 3 or 4 pieces. We each did solo and collaborative performance pieces and so on. That's how I first came to know of Griffith. That's how I first met Marguerite. And then she followed up. She maintained, if she made a connection that she thought was, valuable or interesting or whatever, she would maintain it. And then, she would come back to Toowoomba. She bought the painting from 1980 that is in my show from my graduating show in Toowoomba, which was incredible. And then once we moved to Sydney, she would show up at Art Empire Industry in Sussex Street as well. So she, really phenomenal person. I mean, somebody who really cared and really, was focused on turning over new ground, not just resting. She never rested on her laurels. She was always, looking to grow what it was that she had already built.
That organisation is then called the Queensland Film and Drama Centre, and Marguerite was the director. So that's the direct line to Griffith University Art Museum.
Yeah, so this is before the Queensland College of Art joins the university, and all of these activities are taking place on the Nathan campus.
Which is a amazing campus.
Can you describe what it was like, being on that? It's beautiful, leafy Gumtree campus.
I also spent time there in the 90s as artist in residence. So I was doing a residency working with media art students on kind of performative video kind of things. It's a amazing campus, amazing bit of foresight. I think it was, I was talking to Greg Howard about this, the setting up of that university was quite a progressive kind of idea, and the Vice Chancellor was very progressive, and the head of philosophy, he was saying someone called Val Presley, was really influential in the formation of the IMA as well.
I'm interested in the crossovers here. So there's lots of crossover between Marguerite is also curating exhibitions at the IMA. There's also really healthy ARI, artist run initiative scene in Brisbane at that time. Did it feel like there was a community there? I mean, you both,
I think I can't speak for Jeff, but I think I was not really connected with Brisbane because I was really from Toowoomba and the Downs. So yes, I can't speak for people. I know there were things happening in Brisbane at the same time, so I can't really speak for that.
Well, I had a very tentative connection with the art scene in Brisbane because, I was just not very knowledgeable about any of it, So coming out of high school, I somehow or other knew about the IMA, and I went there quite a few times. And, it both inspired me and served to intensify my frustration. And then, once I got to Toowoomba, I mean, again, John, our stories are really very different here. You arrive at Toowoomba standing on the solid ground of kind of 70s post-conceptualism and avant-garde performance and video, And you have built upon that that foundation throughout your career. Whereas once again, I just arrived trying to figure things out, and I didn't really, how to say this. I mean, like I found myself in Toowoomba, and I took my place in the world in Sydney. It wasn't until I got to Sydney. And, I arrived in Sydney somewhat lost. I mean, all charged up and ready to go. And, I had a few tricks in my backpack. And, I set to getting a studio and painting and running a gallery and all the rest of it. But it wasn't until Art and Text landed on my desk that I really kind of figured out what I wanted to do, because it spoke to me so directly. It was really just incredible. And Art and Text became a kind of a, roadmap into various other publications, most significantly, obviously, October, which in itself also became a roadmap into all the intellectual discourses that would go on to be important to me, So it wasn't until I kind of latched on to that in the second or third year that I was in Sydney that I really kind of felt like I had found my place, you know, that I had found my discourse, but also, you know, my artistic preoccupations. You know, I mean, if you look at my work from that point on, that's when I started kind of working with appropriated media imagery and so on, which, you know, I had all this stuff under my bed, just not really knowing what to do with it. And then all of a sudden I realized, like, oh my God, there's this whole kind of international network of these kids who have been raised in the suburbs, watching TV. They've all got an attitude, you know, they want to move into the art world and make art about popular culture, you know. Not just make popular culture within the world, but make art about popular culture within the art world. And it was at that point that, you know, that was my foundation. I didn't actually have a foundation until I reached Sydney. Everything prior to Sydney was, you know, the getting of wisdom, the gaining of awareness, coming to understand that I could find my way into these things, you know. And I mentioned before that, you know, and getting back to your question, Angela, about the absence of theory, you know, there was none in Toowoomba. And in fact, it didn't even really kind of dawn on me that there should have been, you know, perhaps because I was just too busy, A, having fun playing in a punk band, and B, just, you know, learning by working my way through kind of every medium and ism out there until I felt that I could, you know, embody them somehow. So it wasn't until I got to Sydney until that, you know, I actually found my foundation. And the point I wanted to make was, you know, you mentioned, I said before that I regard myself as an autodidact. That's where it all began to me, you know, and art and text and October were my curriculum, really. And because they made so much sense to me, you know, I mean, you know, a lot of that stuff people say, oh, it's so difficult, so dense or whatever. It wasn't for me. I just like ate it up because it just, you know, was opening doors in my mind and my comprehension, and, you know, it enabled all of my ambitions and all the rest of it. So I really, really just, you know, dove in headlong, and you know, I'm still 30 foot under in that beautiful lake. So, you know, very different paths. And from that point on, you know, I guess things really started to come together for me in that point. At some stage, I realized in order to really kind of participate in this emergent kind of postmodernism that was happening in Sydney, in conjunction with various things that were going on in Melbourne, in order to really be part of that, I had to do you know, grad studies at Sydney College of the Arts, which I did, and it was absolutely the right move to make. And, you know, I was only like, you know, 6 months into that, and we established another artist-run gallery, which basically just kind of became a showcase for the grad students at Sydney College of the Arts. And we were all in one way or another, you know, engaged with kind of pictures generation concerns. And, you know, it was a very sort of, you know, at the time, it seemed like we were very cohesive and reading the same texts and, you know, experimenting in similar ways and so on. But when I look back on it, there was actually incredible diversity of the way we went about it. But there was this kind of, you know, underlying subscription or fealty to, you know, the kind of October generated postmodern semiotics, post-structuralism, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Not that I want to reduce October to that. It was so much more. It really actually covered a hell of a lot of ground. But that's where my education began, and that's where I really began to build something, you know.
John and Jeff, you both graduate in 1980 from Toowoomba, and both of you end up in Sydney very soon after that. Jeff, you set up an artist-run space called Art, Empire and Industry, which you're also living in this kind of warehouse space as well. I mean, and you do that with a cohort of former Toowoomba people, students, fellow students. How did Sydney at that time react to a bunch of punk kids from Toowoomba arriving in their midst?
Kind of half-heartedly, I have to say. so much information to pack in here. By the time I finished my degree or diploma or whatever the hell it was in Toowoomba, it was obvious halfway through my course that the place to be was Sydney. I couldn't go back to Brisbane. It was still a hellhole. And everybody had left, very few people stayed. And, once Joe was on the way out, of course, people began to stay. But prior to that, everybody just left. So going back to Brisbane wasn't an option. And, I had, become so excited, having overcome my frustrations and all the rest of it, and found my path that I just wanted to keep on going, taking it higher and higher and higher. And Sydney really seemed to be the place to go. Melbourne, I just didn't know anything about it. It was too far away. But Sydney, I felt I had some kind of a handle on it. So, we just took a beeline for Sydney. I mean, like everybody that I hung out with, the whole kind of Sad Cases crew, the punk band, we all just jumped in 2 cars and took off, literally. And we arrived, we had organized in advance to kind of go live at 80 Sussex Street in the city. And kind of hook up with Glenn Puster, Gail Pollard, oh my God.
Calvin Brown.
Calvin Brown, thank you. And they had already established.
Who took these photos of you in there? Have you ever seen those?
They're photos of me?
Yeah, inside there. So I just found those.
Probably, I don't know. I have no idea.
In there. Yeah.
Wow.
At the warehouse,
okay.
Yeah. I just found them.
Man, you're a hoarder. Anyway, they had already set up a studio there, and they had found this space, and they wanted to open a gallery on the ground floor, and they basically invited us to kind of join a collective. So I think the collective was James Rogers, who was in the sculpture department. He was the drummer in the Sad Cases, myself and Glenn and Gail and Kelvin. I guess there were 5 collaborators. And, it was really another dream come true, this fabulous, 4-story warehouse in the middle of the city. Again, that didn't last long either. This was just before the inner city living kind of, yuppie, the dawn of the burgeoning yuppie scene, contradiction in terms there. But it was the sort of last gasp for, old beat up warehouse buildings in the city, and we were really just holed up there for a year until the demolition ball came flying through the window. What did happen? So we spent that year running that gallery. It was a wonderful place to land, of course, obviously. But to get to your question, Angela, I was so psyched and so excited, and, we mounted shows of our own work as the opening show and all the rest of it. Not too many people showed up, And at the end of the night, I don't know if you were there for that very first opening, John. If you were, you would remember that we went upstairs afterward to kind of, chill and have a drink or whatever after the, the inaugural opening. Somebody threw a lump of concrete through the plate glass window, So that was kind of it was a sort of, I couldn't help but see it as a symbolic welcome to Sydney, Sydney's a very kind of, I don't know, fashionalized place, a very cliquey place, it's kind of rotten with ambition. I never really found it a terribly kind of generous place,
If I just add in there, I think at that particular time, a whole lot of things came together with real estate, like what happened in New York in the 70s, but on a smaller scale. And Sydney was full of people from everywhere else, So there was, I remember being in the foyer of Performance Space once, and someone from Britain asked me, "So where's everyone from in this foyer?" And I said, "Well, actually, they're all from Queensland, they're from South Adelaide, and they're all from New Zealand, and there's someone from Sydney over there." So there was this influx because there was this cheap rent and these abandoned buildings in Darlinghurst, etc. That changed the kind of culture of the city. People have written about this, but it happened at a particular time, and it didn't last, like Jeff said. But
it collapsed very quickly. Within the space of 2 years, it was an entirely different landscape, But anyway, I sort of came to realize that it was going to be very, very hard to break into anything, and I wasn't even sure that there was anything to break into at that point. It wasn't until, art and text arrived, and the whole kind of postmodern thing took off, and the 80s became the 80s, that there was actually a Sydney art scene. I mean, prior to that, it was just little pockets of people doing cool things, but it didn't really seem to kind of reach critical mass at any point. But anyway, I therefore that lasted for a year, and as I say, that was the end of any inner city warehouses. Everybody just got pushed out to kind of, Piermont and Chippendale and so on, or further out. And I sort of, by the time that was over, I had come to realize that I would really have to kind of, make a concerted effort to insert myself into the milieu of the Sydney art scene. And at that stage, such a scene was really becoming apparent. Sydney College of the Arts became the theory college, and Rosalind Oxley and Stephen Murray and Kerry Crowley were all, beginning to open galleries and so on. And, the operative discourse was definitely kind of, postmodernism. And again, that was something that I felt I understood, and that I was kind of like a postmodern subject, and it was a natural fit for me and so on. So it wasn't until I got into Sydney College of the Arts that I actually began to feel part of something. And, which is just getting back to your original question, Angela, it wasn't a great response. I was disappointed, to be completely honest. I mean, it was the program was kind of schizophrenic. It was a bit of a hodgepodge, but we did some cool things. We did quite a few cool things, I thought. But I was ultimately sort of disappointed that it didn't garner as much attention as it did. Perhaps it wasn't cohesive enough in order for it to do that. I don't know. Perhaps we didn't have, enough power players in our midst for it to really kind of, hit its mark or something. I don't know. But it was a wake-up call. It was a reality check. I got there, and the lump of concrete through the plate glass window was like, oh my God, they're not exactly welcoming us with open arms here, and we're really going to have to kind of, make the right connections, walk into the correct rooms, and just refuse to leave before anything is really going to happen for me,
Hey, Jeff, are you aware of past artists doing something similar, like the Mike Parr, Peter Kennedy space in I think was an old warehouse as well? Are you following in those local artists' footsteps when you're choosing to make an artist-run space?
I think as far as Art Empire Industry was concerned, no, I don't think there was any such program. I think it was just a bunch of people kind of landing in Sydney and wanting to make an opportunity for themselves, Once we were there, I began to learn about our predecessors, as you say. And I also began to scout about to see if anybody else was doing the same thing. And surprisingly, very few, This was really kind of the dawn of the Australian art scene as a culture, I mean, prior to that, it really had been a kind of a cult, When I first got there, I remember there was a space, John, you would know more about this. There was a space in the rocks, tiny little space.
Yeah, Australian Sculpture Centre.
Yeah, the Sculpture Centre, which kind of opened its doors for experimental video and sound pieces and so on, But there were just these tiny little pockets of people laboring away in obscurity, and they only existed by virtue of the generosity and foresight of a handful of people who managed to kind of, squeeze money out of the Australia Council to make these things happen,
There was Waters Gallery.
Tiny, it was tiny. But I felt by the end of the 80s, we had a fully fledged art scene, which then, morphed into a kind of a more worldly, commercially oriented world in the 90s.
Moving to John, your introduction to Sydney was perhaps a bit more structured. You had an early show at Waters Gallery.
Yeah, I was invited to show at Waters out of Toowoomba because he was our examiner, which was fantastic. And I remained friends with Frank through his whole life. But I moved on to Rosalind Oxley, so I was in like the second or third show at Rosalind Oxley, and I used to have a show of video work every year at Rosalind Oxley. A lot of those works are now in Queensland Art Gallery or National Gallery. So
how would you describe your entry into Sydney?
well, I was tagging along with Jeff basically. They were really the ones driving this, and I was tagging along. But I curated some sound and performance stuff and did some at Art Empire Industry. And I immediately went to Sydney College of the Arts and did a postgrad year, and that was fantastic. You know, you'd be sitting in there, and you know, in the staff room would be Marina Abramovich and Ole, or you know, there was all these people hanging out there, which was really great.
It was really the gateway, wasn't it? Sydney College of the Arts at that point.
Yeah, like Jane Campion.
Really nowhere else to go. Nowhere else to do it.
Well, the other art school was terrible, it was good, but I was really frustrated because, in fact, in Queensland, I had access to equipment because I need technology, and the whole setup of art schools in Sydney, it's still the bane of my life because I teach in art schools in Sydney, not set up properly to, you know, not with the latest equipment, you know, whereas in Toowoomba, I actually went back to Toowoomba in like 82 or something to make a whole lot of video works that ended up being shown all around the world because I could I could borrow some stuff in Toowoomba because people had the foresight to set up something where, you know, and I did something in exchange for it or something like that. So yeah, Sydney was a bit of a disaster in that sense, but
Yeah,
also.
well, you know, it was very much caught up in a kind of post-object world.
Yeah. What do you need to
facilities and equipment? You know, one didn't.
We're still
need
having
to
this stupid
material
debate.
object.
We're still having that stupid debate. You know, it's amazing. But I met people like Mike Parr and David Ahern, who was at Sydney College then, who was I spent a lot of time with him, who'd been a student of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. And because the idea of these art schools originally were not just as visual art schools, but Sydney College of the Arts. So it would have an amazing experimental music department. It would have, you know, that was the kind of original concept. And like City Art Institute, the other one, which became Alexander Mackie, they had a dance stream as well. They had a contemporary dance in that as well. So there was this sense of a larger kind of sense of what an art school idea, which comes from the English art school idea, might do. So yeah, Sydney College of the Arts was pretty. It was the hip place to be in, you know, the early 80s in Sydney for quite a long time. And there was some great people there. You know, David Ahern was the person I connected with. He was brilliant. He'd been the arts editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, great writer, had been Stockhausen's personal assistant in Germany. He was a child composing prodigy, but he was across all of the arts. You know, he was really quite an amazing, and we just talked all the time, so it was fantastic. Yeah, I was only there briefly, but yeah, I had this into the gallery, so yeah. And the other place that was interesting was UTS, because they were and I ended up teaching there first of all. The idea was to set up a media department that would change the media, and quite visionary people set that up and influenced by.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, that you know, UTS was incredibly important right throughout the 80s. I mean, it probably kind of, you know, was really a sort of a revolutionary force from the early 80s, maybe 81 through 85, 86, sometime around there. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I always felt that I had one foot in Sydney College and one foot in UTS. And, you know, my social group was made up half of Sydney College people and half of UTS people. And not many people made that crossover, but I think you know, the space in the Venn diagram for me was subculturalism, you know, which played well in a kind of postmodern high art culture, but it also played well in a critical media culture context. So I drew on, you know, both discourses, both sets of discourses there.
And that's a shift, Jeff. Do you think it's thinking about art in relation to the subculture versus as a countercultural activity? You know, that there's some sense of participation in popular culture, or some sense of maybe institutionalization of art, that it could function in an institutional sense within broader culture at large?
You mean that subcultures could function? That
Yeah.
I'm not clear about your question.
This idea that this kind of realization in the early 80s, from my perspective, seems to be this view that visual art has some role to play within popular culture. And it's not this thing that sits outside of it. It's not, it doesn't need a completely different set of criteria to understand that the,
Right.
you know, post-punk thing, DIY, that's, they can kind of cohabit, and you can have a kind of commercial art scene that can support this experimental stuff as well.
The interesting thing for me about the emergence of postmodernism in relation to my fascination with subculturalism and so on was that it just kind of brought everything with it. It was concerned with dissolving boundaries between high and low, and dissolving boundaries between various disciplines. And anyone who had a critical perspective on anything kind of qualified for consideration. And I felt that, punk was a kind of like a very dramatic manifestation of a critical perspective on popular culture. These were people, and I count myself among them, and this was a global phenomenon, which was an interesting thing too, because it all happened simultaneously. Everybody had the same ideas, and they were responding to the same sense of disenchantment with popular culture. Which in many places, of course, is the only culture one has. And if you're raised in the suburbs, it is most definitely the only culture you have. All of a sudden, there were not these, walls between all of these different things. And, I think, I think the most dramatic illustration you can use of all of this is the kind of, the early 80s New York Pictures generation artists. They were all making work that was, a meditation, a critical meditation on, cinema, TV, cartoons, comics, trash culture, whatever. It was all just a kind of a critical rethinking of all of this stuff that we'd been, hogging out on all our lives up to that point. So that's the way I viewed it. I just saw within the art world the opportunity to kind of articulate my misgivings about the culture of my upbringing to a certain extent, and that there was a kind of validating discourse ready-made there for it, And I think a similar kind of thing was also happening in the world of in the world of media and the world of media studies. There were a lot of people, and I still have these friendships today with people who are working in SBS and the ABC and so on, and trying to find ways of making meaningful critical culture within those kind of somewhat mainstream contexts. So I don't know, that's a very roundabout way of answering your question, but to me, it was all based on that. It was all based on the fact that we were a TV generation, and there were those who wanted to continue to make critical TV, and there were those who wanted to kind of take a more meta perspective on it and step aside from it and, look at the kind of, not only the semiotics, but the kind of formalist aesthetic aspects of popular culture and how that might relate to the history of art and so on, So that, again, the area of overlap in the Venn diagram for me was a sort of anger toward popular culture and anger toward the world, which was the fuel of punk rock,
John, do you have anything to add there in terms of, your intellectual groundings and perhaps even the kinds of debates and discussions that are playing out in art and text that Jeff is participating in, in the 80s?
I guess I was less involved in that, and less, probably reading a lot less than Jeff, and more making and more, the magazine I read religiously was ZG, which was you would remember that, which was New York, London, or New York mostly, Meg, I
If I
think.
can just say at this point, God bless Sonia Jeffrey and Manic Exposure for bringing all of that material into Australia. That was incredible. All the semiotext publications and so on, you know, she was amazing.
This is the golden age of the magazine, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it kind of is,
Australia.
yeah. That's right, of the critical art and culture magazines, sure, cultural studies.
But that also existed before, like in art magazines. Like I know Peter Kennedy and Mike Parr and stuff. You know, they were very. Studio International was, all those magazines. And they were in the pages of Studio International. With idea demonstrations, with 1971 or two. So magazines are really important before the internet. So I guess more theoretically it was through friends and colleagues, and same as Jeff, I knew lots of people who were, teaching media studies or media art theory, media.
In fact, John, I think you're one of the only people that I, associated with, that I knew of in Sydney, who shared that kind of split,
right?
Split concentration between the UTS crew and the SEA crew.
And I became part of the UTS crew as an academic. So there were some amazing, brilliant people there who, Megan
Ross
Morris,
Gibson,
your brother, Megan Morris, a lot of great thinkers, some of them who had a connection to Sydney Uni as well. And I remember that sort of a kind of culmination in that bizarre thing, which was Jean Baudrillard's visit to Sydney, who was very connected back to Griffith University, to Nick Zerbrook.
Now that was a question I was going to ask earlier that I missed. Sorry. So John, were you aware of the influence in Griffith University, that kind of intellectual atmosphere that was so
very
fascinating and very energetic and very internationally connected?
Yeah.
And it seemed to swirl around Nicholas Zerbrook.
Yeah, he was a brilliant guy, and he had just started, I think, when we did that. In maybe 80 or 81, I don't know. I think I remember meeting him. He had a black skivvy on, and he walked out of London like he's Swiss, British, and he died way too young. But he ended up writing a lot about my work, and he had this amazing kind of thing where he'd go, he'd interview William S. Burroughs, or he'd interview, he had all this amazing material. This amazing kind of intellectual debate with people and talk and these interviews with people. So I
actually wish I had been more connected to that.
Yeah, he was.
I was preoccupied elsewhere, but I was aware that was going on. But
his background was English lit, but like Beckett and Joyce, and but he expanded to the whole of kind of contemporary avant-garde, and he had a different take on postmodernism than a lot of people.
Exactly.
He died quite young, so it's very sad. Like, there was a lot of amazing obituaries in the UK about him after he died, but I think he was very important to his contribution to Australia and to Griffith University.
And he did bring Baudrillard to Australia?
Yeah, he was a friend of Baudrillard's. I remember, actually, I was working for that conference. I was asked to do sound for the first English language production of Marguerite Duras's Malady of Death, which is translated by some French artists that had come to a show of mine and said, "Oh, please work with us." Nard Vigueur was the director and translator. This is the first. So Duras's text was only a couple of years out, and they presented it at Bondi Pavilion, and Baudrillard was in the audience. And anyway, we went afterward. It was really great, and we went to her translation is better than the common English one. Afterwards, we were at some dance party, and I was talking to Baudrillard and a whole lot of people, and he said, people take my work way too seriously. So he thought of it as it's intellectual provocation, as partly where he was coming from that French tradition, that was kind of interesting, because it was kind of like this. It was like
he's also dodging responsibility there too.
Yeah, I guess so.
He said that kind of thing often,
Yeah,
and
right.
often when he was in a corner, he would say that thing.
Oh, it's getting dark in New York.
Yeah, it's getting lighter here. So so there was that, you know, theory and ideas and stuff were definitely floating around in a kind of, you know, away in Sydney at that time, which was quite interesting and sort of.
Yeah, intellectual life was you know, very full, very sharp in Sydney in the 80s.
So I guess I was lucky to have been, you know, working with video very early on. That was partly fortuitous of who my teachers were, etc. And it clicked with me because of its similarity to sound production, etc. So I guess for us in the 80s, it was, I could, you know, I was immediately showing work in Japan and in Chile and in France, etc., etc. And video was a way for us as artists in Australia to be able to show our work internationally. So you could put a videotape in the mail and post it somewhere. So Mike and Peter Kennedy, etc., in previous decades had been involved in mail art and things like that. So, and in fact, they used to send reels of film to places and they'd crop up in France or whatever. But through video, we were able to, suddenly become part of an international world of video festivals, video galleries, video, etc. So for me, that was like, whereas if you wanted to move a painting, God forbid, or a sculpture or an object or something, like, you know, it's not going to happen, you know, like you're not, unless you've got a lot of money, unless there's a, you know, there's a commercial imperative behind it to be able to move something. Whereas video was before the internet, was a fantastic way of. So I saw video as kind of like a container where I could put all these kinds of other ideas and other forms into it and then package it up.
It was also the container that worked for you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't choose video because it was easy to mail to Europe, you know.
Yeah.
You chose video because you said yourself, you know, it clicked for you. It was your medium. It was your language. Yeah, and it just happened to have the incredible advantage of being portable.
Yeah, and there was, I guess, I mean, so the video that developed in Australia and Peter Callis and Jill Scott and myself and a few other people that were able to, to show work internationally, and that sort of culminated in that show that happened at the Museum of Modern Art in '93 called Eccentric Orbit, which had a lot of that work kind of catalogued in that. But it was the uniqueness of that medium.
Can you remember the first fully digital work that you produced, John?
Oh, digital or analog?
Digital, that transition from video.
I remember playing with some equipment from Fairlight on their video stuff, which Peter Callis really took to a whole other level. So he's sort of known around the world as the first visual artist that really explored computer graphics. That's not totally true, but made a whole oeuvre out of it. So yeah, probably early 80s, working with some really, and computers, yes. In fact, I was working with people that were writing code to change the cadence of frames and stuff with controlling analog equipment. So there was, and actually on Australian computers called a micro-B that they were supplying to the Soviet Union, which is bizarre. So it was, so that was the early kind of digital stuff, but digital audio probably more than digital video because it's a lot easier.
And of course, you know, that important early video collection that Marguerite and others collected, the last few years have been working very hard on digitizing those works and preserving them for the future, which is a huge task.
Fantastic.
And of course, Jeff, you know, you come from screen printing and working in terms of graphic design in a very analog way, like literally cut and paste, to your work now, which, you know, the manifestation of pictopoiesis in the exhibition is a fascinating one in terms of tracking these analog methods of working to that digital space, which then we've turned back into an analog space in the show. Do you want to comment on those kinds of tracings of those trajectories in your practice?
Sure. Again, you know, different to John. I mean, I was not a, you know, pioneering digital artist or whatever. I tend to kind of let those things develop. to the point, I guess I'm not really interested in them until they become part of culture and they become manifest within culture. And then I begin to see, what they are, how they're functioning, what they're doing, what the problems are, and so on. That's when I get interested. I guess I'm critical by nature. And so for me, I talked before about kind of taking my place in the world or whatever. Once I got to Sydney, that's when my trajectory really began. Where I can kind of trace something back to a point of origin. And if you look at, if you had to kind of encapsulate my method, it's been one of editing and cutting and pasting, And right throughout the 80s, of course, I was hoovering up images out of libraries, Xeroxing. I had boxes and boxes of Xerox images. I was very much a kind of definitive postmodern image scavenger, and then putting them back together in kind of, critical or problematizing kind of configurations and so on. I share your dislike for being burdened by objet d'art, John. I was very interested all along in kind of ephemeral things. I didn't really want to get bogged down with this stuff. So, from the very beginning, I was interested in kind of taking ideas from culture, converting them into something else, and then putting them back into culture somehow. I did make objects along the way, but really, the most kind of consistent continuum in my career has been one of sucking out and putting back in, and I've perhaps I would be a wealthy man now if I'd taken another path, but I was never really too interested in the objet d'art, the unique original objet d'art or whatever. I was more interested in the process, both, subjective and formless, but also critically cultural, or, its propensity, its capacity to, mess with culture somehow. So, as a sort of an editor or a cut and paste artist, at some point, it just became so much easier, and the scope just kind of multiplied and expanded once the internet came along. Because you didn't have to go to the library, you didn't have to spend $20 on Xeroxes, you didn't have to kind of like cart a knapsack full of Xeroxes home and then spread them all out and figure what to do with them. You could have 30,000 images on a hard drive. So it was just a kind of, for me, it was a natural transition. Because I was just moving with the way that culture was moving, and because I my whole career has been one that is like running alongside of culture, pelting it with rocks or whatever, and or celebrating the wonderful things too. It's not all negative. But for me, it was just it was a natural transition. It happened around the time I moved to New York, I guess. I said before, I wasn't a pioneering computer head or whatever, but at the same time, mainly through my work with art and text, I was there at the dawn of desktop publishing. I had the very first Mac, I had the very first version of Quark Express, and I kind of grew up with it. So I was using digital material to produce critical culture. From the very beginning, from the beginning of that process. And at some point, it just didn't make sense any longer to go to the library, and from that point on, I sort of started to, shift my practice, I guess, accordingly. It wasn't a conscious thing. The change in process determined a different outcome, I suppose, But, I moved to New York in 1998, and by that stage, Google searches were a thing. They were certainly becoming a thing. The internet was clunky, and people were still using modems and all that kind of stuff, but you could still start sucking imagery out of the internet, Whereas now, of course, you just hit a button and it comes pouring out for you. So, because my art is concerned largely with culture, of one sort or another, high or low, recondite or trash, I order from the entire menu, then my work just moved in the direction of, digitization, because that's the way the world moved. But very gratifying to see it back in real space. I mean, I've reached this point now, I think a lot of us have, where my phone is really, I'm not exaggerating, starting to make me sick. It's really, there is no denying the kind of, enervating and addictive nature of the scroll, and it's kind of reached a crisis point. Certainly here, a lot of people are complaining about Instagram now, where it's gotten to the point where the algorithm is just so manipulative that it's just not fun anymore. For a long time, it was like, oh, your friend's doing all this cool stuff. And like, oh, it has the capacity for all sorts of creative applications and so on. And now you're just trying to fend off, the suggested posts, which are so bonkers, have nothing to do with my interests, very occasionally they actually ding, hit a bell. And I guess that's all they're trying to do. You throw enough lines out, you eventually catch a fish. So, I kind of feel like Instagram is a sewer these days. And, we've reached this point now where we're sort of starting, I certainly am, and a lot of my friends are, and there's, a lot of these kinds of, opinion pieces in the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the rest of it about pulling back from the internet and doing certain things in an analog fashion and disciplining yourself so you're not just like, numbing your brain and in the process ceasing to read, which is a terrible thing, So I kind of feel, in a sense, putting Picta Poesis on the wall is, in a way, returning to reality.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, well, anything more to add to that, John? Because we've really got like 5 minutes left. Yeah.
No, I think
we've got a great discussion that we can.
Do you want me? I'm just wondering, do you just want me to show you what some of those things that...
Sure, I want to see the performance if you can show that.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is the thing that brought us all together here, the event.
So this is actually stills of that thing we were just talking about before. Right. So that's about 2.5 meters or 3 meters high. And James Rogers, and maybe you, Jeff, actually put those boxes together while I was... Yeah,
we all did.
Yeah, and it changed a lot, and that was also shown at Waters Gallery in the next year. And then... I
remember you got those gels, they were sample gels.
Yeah, I've still got some, actually.
Lighting company or whatever. Yeah, I wrote to the same company and got a set myself and did some stuff when I first got this.
Yeah. You were doing projection stuff as well, I think.
I fooled around with it. I didn't know whether it actually ever saw the light of day.
I remember jumping around in one.
In Sydney?
No. In this night, you did.
In that night. Yeah, no, I did something or other. Yeah. I don't remember what it was, but
yeah. And then, okay. So this is a recording of
That's Marguerite.
Yeah, that's Marguerite. And the beginning of the tape was wrecked, I think. So it's not the whole thing. So I'll just play a couple little bits.
Sorry, John, where and when was this?
This is the same night. It's in June 1980.
Right.
And this was, I don't know if it was before the audience came in or after. And it was shot by a guy called John Prescott, who also was a student of David Perry's. I think he worked for Griffith University. And somehow I've ended up with the tapes, and I must restore this properly. And it's a piece by Greg Howard called Walking with Intent. Right. And it's a workshop that he was conducting at Griffith, at Queensland Film and Drama Centre, as it's called then, with mostly students on the Nathan campus. So it's a work that it's a process piece that uses singing of tones and recording on cassette recorders. There's a strange bit of technology. So they had like 15 cassette recorders that people carried around, building up layers and rewinding, recording, and then they leave all the cassette players in the room for the tapes to die out. So it's quite a beautiful, delicate thing.
I remember now, or at least I think I remember.
Yeah, but that's a great picture of Marguerite.
Fantastic. Greg just made an appearance there.
Yes, all right. And there's the plinths lined up ready for the next.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
What else is there? Oh, this is also curated by Marguerite. That's at the Institute of Modern Art in 1982 or 3, and that's Video Projector. That's my solo show there. It was packed full of people, and that's with Michael Sheridan, the guitarist.
Right.
Lots of projection.
That's
film.
1982. You were playing with Michael Sheridan in 1982.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's a video projector that Marguerite must have borrowed or hired or something, which is a pretty rare thing in 1982 or 83. It says there. So they were in the daytime. It was there was video installation, and at nighttime there was performances. It's the same thing. Yeah, similar thing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That'll do it.
Okay.
What's that called, John?
What was that? Oh, it was just the show would have been just John Gillies at the IMA.
Yeah, we can
And
label
I
that.
did 2 solo shows at the IMA that she curated, and then in the early 80s. And a lot of that work had been shown at Roslyn Oxley Gallery at the same time, a lot of the video work.
Great. Okay, well, thank you both so much for talking with us today. It's been fascinating to learn about the different trajectories of both of your practices and the intersections, but also the departures. And I think to get a better sense of the intellectual, the artistic, the philosophical kind of underpinnings of, 2 major figures within this history, and both who have such importance to the histories of this institution, Griffith University Art Museum, and multiple wider artistic contexts. Thank you both for joining us today. And thanks so much, Wes, for also being involved too.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Thank you.